My talk is, I'm going to go directly into it very quickly. What I'm going to attempt to do is to try and describe some of the current changes that our planet has been experiencing in terms of our collective experience as humanity, and try to bring it in perspective so that we can understand our individual journeys and how it comes together with the whole collective human experience. So all nice to have our individual journeys and have our individual interpretations of what life is, but there is a common connective truth that permeates through all of our individual experiences that I would like to reach for and hopefully share with you, okay? My book, The Key to Light. I'm going to just, first, before I start, bring everybody up to the speed to the fact that there's a silent revolution going on in physics. As we speak, it isn't as momentous as Galileo's discovery of the heliocentric movement of the Earth around the sun. But there's an introduction of something that was eluding scientists for a long time, how to interpret, how to bring consciousness into the conversation. The tenets of science can't give any credence to something that cannot be validated, cannot be empirically documented, and cannot be predictably calculated, okay? They've been trying to use string theory and Higgs boson particles to try and describe the universe as being a physical, materialistic type of paradigm, something that it has to originate from something material because they can calculate it. And they've been failing miserably all along. And they've been trying to come up with a unified field theory to describe how to see commonality between the macro universe and the subatomic realm. And from Einstein to Hawkins, they've been failing. The latest foray was something called string theory that has also been failing miserably because they can't seem to find a way to make it work. Now they're coming up with something called emergent theory. I don't know if anybody's heard about it, where they're finally beginning to recognize that the universe is emergent from a consciousness and it's built itself in order to have this experience. And all of the science that they've been trying to describe is really an emergent manifestation from a universal consciousness. My throat is getting dry already. Is this my water?
Yes.
Good. So since they're now physicists are now becoming metaphysicists, so to speak. And I'm a metaphysicist, so I never had such restrictions on my philosophy. I'm able to bring the abstract into my argument. And I don't know why I'm feeling nervous here. I've never been nervous before in front of a crowd. I think it's because I'm excited, you know. This book took 4 years for me to put together, and now I'm going to get right to it, okay? So consciousness is defined as a state of being aware. It is the awakened state from which all experience is observed objectively and through which all experience is felt subjectively. So right away we sense a binary definition towards our experience of consciousness, where there's an objective passive state, which we can further elucidate here. There we go. Can divide it in two states. Objective awareness is a state from which one assumes the perspective of an observer in an experience and sees themselves as an object within that experience. It's passive and introspective. Subjective awareness is a state from which one assumes the perspective of a participant in an experience and sees themselves as a subject through which that experience is felt. It is active and sensory. So right away we get the idea of duality and the whole idea of consciousness. And this plays perfectly into what actually consciousness represents. And to get to what it really means, we would have to enter into something we call cosmology, where we study the science that examines the origin and development of the universe, okay? So we know that the void, what is the void? We know that most cosmology experiences begin with in the beginning. And in the beginning is something that defines something that has some space and time connotation to it. It's a manifestation. Anything that is created must have a beginning. And so in order for something to have a beginning, it has to be preceded by something, because nothing can just materialize out of nothing unless the nothingness is something. And the nothingness turns out to be what we call the void. It's a formless, spaceless, timeless experience that we can define as eternity, we can define as infinity since it's spaceless and timeless. And that is the actual state of divine mind, and it is this place from where everything begins. All things come from no thingness, and so the void represents a singularity that is unbroken and is uninterrupted, and it isn't until it moves that it becomes a thing, and when it moves, that movement is collapsed into a space we call the light. And so the light becomes a subjective experience within the huge nothingness. Suddenly something appears in the middle of nothing. And so now we've got a duality, we've got an original state of something surrounded by the state that preceded it. So we must give that space that preceded it a name, so now the void becomes the dark. All right, so now we know that the concentration of consciousness into a point, which we call the light, has now created the first duality, and the dark, which we call the mother principle, suddenly becomes an embodiment of all of the principles of the void, timelessness and spacelessness, okay? So suddenly time is contained in the concept of the light, which has an in the beginning, but we would never really know that in the beginning was given birth to by something that was by duality, a feminine experience. This is where the birthing from the womb gets its metaphorical connotation from. So now suddenly we've got a duality, a dual state, that when interacted with each other creates a third state that we call the vertical axis of consciousness. Why do we call it vertical? Because it has a spectrum, a continuum from high frequency to low frequency, and so we can connect that along a vertical lane, a vertical path, a vertical connection, so to speak. And we call this the vertical axis of consciousness, and suddenly we have a third state. We can call this now a trinity, the light, the dark, and the vertical axis of consciousness, okay? So moving right along, we've been familiarized with the whole concept of the light and the dark from Eastern mysticism, from Oriental philosophy, where they describe the light as the yang and the dark as the yin, the female principle being embodied by the dark, and the masculine being embodied by the light, okay? And this is something that we tried to explain through geometry. The sacred geometry describes, we can do a little thing here, the original state as being first a dot that becomes a circle, all right? So the nothingness becomes a circular experience. Sacred geometry uses circles to define spherical reality, okay? So we know that the first sphere created a second sphere. The intersecting node between the two, we call the Pisces vesicle, is where the vertical axis of consciousness is formed, okay? And it is in that space that all the creation unfolds, okay? So the Pisces vesicle represents the vertical axis of consciousness, and as we continue to add concentric circles to it, we get to add complexity and form to creation itself. So the seed of life, and eventually the flower of life, and eventually the cube of Metatron represent the geometries of all existence within its pattern. The flower of life is a pattern that's been found in ancient archaeological findings from various diverse cultures that have no connection but seem to have this common knowledge. So it speaks to some sort of a common ancestor in all of our diverse experiences. That's an interesting conversation we'll have another time. We won't get into that. All right, so we can basically divide the void into verses. If you use numerology to describe it, the light is described as 1. It comes from the 0. The void is given the number 0. And from the 1 becomes the light. And so the 2, by the fact that the void becomes the second state along with it, becomes 2. So the dark becomes 2, light becomes 1, 0 is the void itself. Father male principle versus mother female principle. Space-time representing the qualities of a particular experience. Infinity and eternity describes the dark. The light, a subjective experience, because suddenly now consciousness is now having a subjective experience. It's a thing. And the objective is the void around it watching that experience. Remember, the passivity of objectivity is to watch the experience. The activity of the subject experience is to be involved in it. So if the void is to be called God, is to be called the beginning of all things, divine intelligence, then the subjective experience will be called I am, and the objective looking at it is I am that I am. So suddenly now we can recognize the two names of God, I am representing the light principle, and I am that I am being embodied by the dark. It's something that most people didn't recognize, but it's right there staring at us in our face. The activity, the passivity, the particle of experience of a thing that is formed versus the spacelessness and timelessness we call a wave. Physics has already determined that all light can be either a particle or a wave. And so we know that all creation is either formed into a particle or it can be a wave. And when it's formed into an actual manifested thought, it's called a thought form. When it's put back into potential, where it doesn't exist yet, but it is there to be tapped into, it's called a waveform. So manifestation versus potential, effect versus cause, linear experience versus omnipresent, all places, all at once. So we can actually divide all of our experience into a duality, and then we can see how all the things meet. Is that interesting? I thought so too. By the way, I put that together myself. Thank you very much. Okay, so the vertical axis of consciousness really is a matter of physics, if we want to look at it that way. We can decide that when light becomes a particle, call it photon, all right? It emerges into reality at a very high frequency, and then it descends in frequency as it comes down, and with decreasing frequency comes increasing density, okay? Increasing density is associated with eventually a collapse into matter, and matter at its most concentrated form forms the opposite end of the vertical axis. So we can see that light in its most photonic state at its highest frequency is represented by the upper level of the vertical axis of consciousness, and light in its densest form is represented as something that has an actual physical core-like experience. We'll find out that it's actually the center of all planets that houses sentient beings, okay? So the planetary core represents the other end of the vertical axis of consciousness. And then you can divide it into 8 planar realms in between, which we will call it dimensions, okay? So we can now divide those 8 planar realities into 8 spaces, the 9th being the departure from the octave of dimensional planes. The reason why the octave works in our physical reality is because it's a reflection of this truth, that all reality is divided into 8 levels, from very high frequency that's contained and defined by its frequency and its density. So it's very little density at the highest level, at the 8, more density, less frequency as it descends, and by the time you get to the 5th, you've come to a density that is so near to threshold that by the time you get to the 4th, these particles become polarized into positively and negatively charged particles. From the 5th and above, the particles, the photons that make up reality are neutral. But by the time it gets to the 4th dimension, the effect of gravity, which has an attractive force so powerful that it actually sends gravitational waves up the vertical axis and continues and further adds to the pulling together. The closer the proximity is to the 1D, the more it actually attracts the photonic particles to it, and it contributes to the density that we experience at the lower realms. So by the time we get to 4D, we've got polarization of particles, where in that space we've got a spectrum of experience, a spectrum of expressions that is so diverse that it brings into play the multidimensionality that we experience at 4D at a level where it's almost an infinite number of expressions. And by the time you descend from 4D to 3D, it actually, something interesting happens. It finds a threshold that it crosses that actually collapses into matter itself. So thus is born the physical world, okay? So the physical world and the dimensions below are defined by 3D, which is at the surface, 2D, which is below the surface, and 1D, which is at the core of planets, okay? And so the physical universe is contained within the first three dimensions, and the five that are above are representative of the spiritual planes. So this is a nice little diagram. This is interesting. You find this interesting? I think it's interesting. There we go. Those are the dimensional planes. This is a representation they found out in I'm trying to remember, 83? I can't remember. There was an earthquake in Bolivia, and they did some studies that determined that the core of the planet is not molten, but instead it's a solid crystal core. And this is something that scientists were very surprised to find, because we've been taught in school that the core of the planet is a molten ball, you know? Am I learning enough time? I'm going to run out of time. And so we find out now that indeed the physics that we've seen in dimensional physics that is confirmed by the fact that our planet is indeed housed by a 1,500-mile wide crystal made of iron that has a hexagonal design, and it is extremely dense and powerful, and it gives off a powerful gravitational force. So we know that this is what's happening, and we know that the experience that we have with the iron core resonates with the iron crystals in our own bodies. So now we understand why, and this is why our grounding to the planet Earth is so easy to accomplish, because we're literally one with the planet, and we're literally one with 1D. Now, if 1D is housing the Divine Mother, it makes sense that we at 3D actually have more of an affinity to the first dimension, because the 8th dimension is so far away. It's easier for us to actually ground and to bond with Mother God, but Mother God tends to be a topic that's left out of most religions, so we don't get to actually have that knowledge of our connection with Mother Earth taught in most religions. I think you guys are all right. You got quite a few feminine deities. Some of the other ones seem to miss that note. They didn't get the memo. All right, so we know now that we have, in our human experience, we have these auric bodies, which are actually containments of each one of those 8 dimensions within our own experience. Each one of the dimensional planes is represented in an energy field that contains the human body. We have the causal body, which actually resonates with the 8th dimension. The 8th dimensional resonant frequency in the human body is called the causal body. And it is this body that actually contains the highest level of the human experience, where the highest self is manifests. The highest level at which human beings can actually experience God is at the 8th dimension, which is at the causal body. So we'll find the embodiment of the God principle at its highest expression at the causal body. In Christianity, we call it Christ consciousness. In Buddhism, you got Buddhic body, you got cosmic consciousness. There's so many different names for the experience of the God mind at the causal body level. At the next level, we've got the celestial body, which is a frequency lower, and it resonates with the 7th dimension. And we know that at the 8th dimension, there is frequencies of photons give expression to light, but as it descends down the dimensional cascade, light gives way to sound. It reaches a threshold where light becomes sound, and that sound, which you guys said is the first sound, was Om, and that occurred at the 7th dimension. And this is where we get the term the music of the spheres, because that sound is what it actually becomes the encoded frequency, the encoded intention, divine intention of divine mind for the geometry and for the design of the universe. All right. So we've come to the next level, which is called the etheric template body, which is resonant with the 6th dimension, and we find that at that level, sound has precipitated into structural form, geometrical form, and it actually is the template that the human body is designed that is permanent, indelible. It cannot be changed at that point. Our perfect design is laid at that level, and at the level of the 6th dimension is where sacred geometry finds its expression. It's also where sound becomes language, and it's also where we can actually reach our consciousness towards in order to restore ourselves back to our original design. This is the site at which divine healing occurs, okay? Then below that, we have the astral body, which is resonant with the fifth dimension. And the fifth dimension is the space where geometric form takes on more substance and it becomes an actual realm, an interactive realm where ascended masters go to live and where you actually have a more diverse and experienced, we've got worlds that are made up of the fifth dimension where you have a concept called unity consciousness resides, where the beings of that particular realm are in oneness with divine mind, and there's no deviation from it. So this is the realm in which we experience unity consciousness. And then we step down into the mental and the emotional bodies. These are the bodies that are resonant with the fourth dimension, which we now experience a departure from unity consciousness into duality consciousness. Remember, we got polarization of particles to positive and negative, and we've also got a polarization of moralities, our truths, our expressions, where we can have experience of good and evil, and issues that depart from unity consciousness, from divine mind. All of this can occur at the fourth dimension, and our mental body, which is the body that services cognitive function, the emotional body that services our emotional experiences. It's interesting that at the level of duality, we experience polarization at the 4D. Also, our auric body would actually polarize at that level to a mental and emotional body as well, giving further expression to that whole experience. We know that the mental and emotional body, though, have to work in tandem in order to create. You just can't think a thing into creation. Everything is fluid at this point, so what is thought can become created. But at the level of the fourth dimension, you'll have to have cooperation between the emotional and mental bodies to come together in order to create a thought form, okay? And a thought form is a thing that eventually becomes a template on which creation builds itself. And then we come down to the etheric body, which is the auric body that is responsible for all the electrical functions in the body. It's the one that carries life force from the higher levels into the physical body. It's the one that gives us our ECGs, and it's the one that you can see without clairvoyant vision, just with a slight, if you can focus your eyes away from the thing that you're looking at, you can literally see the grayish blue aura around trees and around the body. It's very easy to see with our 3D visions. You don't have to be clairvoyant, but you would have to be clairvoyant in order to see the other ones above it, okay? Then we've got the physical body, which is not an auric body, but there we are, okay? So here we have it. That's the auric bodies and the anatomy of the galaxy. This is just to show you that just as the human body, just as above, so below, just as the human body has 8 levels of expression, 8 frequency layers of expression, so does a galaxy, which is the greatest thing that can be experienced in the created universe. And we know that at the center of a galaxy, at the 8-dimensional level, is what we call the great sun, the great galactic sun. But we know that the 9th dimension, which the human body doesn't involve itself in, is a portal that takes us from the human experience into the celestial planes up above. So the 9th dimension is represented by a black hole that sits in the middle of the great central sun. The 8th dimension is represented by the sun itself. The 7th dimension that we know is responsible for frequency of sound is contained in these bands called photon bands, which actually contains all of the frequencies that can be found in the electromagnetic spectrum, from gamma rays right down to radio waves. And it moves out in the form of a toroid shape. So even though when we look at a galaxy, we see a planar shape. That's only because our 3D vision is only able to see the planar shape of it. But what we don't really see is the actual 7D globular spherical shape that is actually the true shape of everything actually, all right? And the galaxy as well. So we've got the 7th dimension being represented by photon bands. We've got the 6th dimension, which is represented by the positioning of planets. This is where astrology gets its credence from. The position of suns and planets is the expression of a galaxy at the 6th dimension. The 5th dimension represents the home of the ascended masters and unity consciousness and those realms that house that level of being. The 4th dimension, of course, represents the afterlife that we experience on every planet. The third dimension, of course, is the actual beings that walk on the earth, but the actual physical planet itself. The second, the activity that goes on underneath the surface of the planet, and the core represents the first dimension. So the anatomy of the galaxy is the same as a human being. We're both reflective of the same truth, okay? All right. Chakras are spinning wheels of vortical energy that anchors the auric body to a central canal that extends from the eight-dimensional body, the causal body, that's called the sushumna, which is the central canal that connects the top of the causal body from the top to the bottom, is actually able to send energy to the lower auric bodies, and the sites through which that connection happens is actually the chakras themselves. So these are like transducers that are able to through a two-way experience and a feedback system, send energy into the lower bodies and receive energy and data from it to send it back to the higher self. So there's an interactive and interconnecting experience going on. The root chakra services the etheric body, which is at 3D. The sacral chakra services the emotional body at 4D. The navel chakra services the mental body at 4D. The heart chakra services the astral body at 5D. The throat chakra services the etheric template body at 6D. The brow chakra, the third eye or the ajna, services the celestial body at 7D. And the crown chakra services the causal body at 8D. Straightforward? All right, I haven't lost anybody because I know I'm speaking to the choir. Now we're going to talk about the Ascension, something very interesting that's happening. All right, how much more time do I have? And the Ascension is something that it's been described by many cultures, many religions, shamanic, major religions, about the shift that the planet Earth is about to experience as it undergoes a natural maturation process that all systems in nature demonstrate a seed growing into a tree. And we're not stuck with where we are, whether we want to participate or not. There's going to be a growth and an evolution beyond where we are. And it's what we call this, in our experience as humanity, moving forward to the next level. We call this the Ascension, the progression of our consciousness from a lower consciousness state, which we are at now at 3D and 4D. We have physical bodies at 3D, third dimension. I'm going to just lower the, I just collapse the word dimension into the word letter D. So we have the human experience where the physical body is at 3D and our mental and emotional experiences are at 4D. And what's happening is that we're resonant with the planet, and the planet itself, which is a 4D system, is about to shift into the fifth dimension, beyond the realm of duality and polarization into unity consciousness, okay? And if we need to keep up with the planet, we have to also raise our consciousness so that we can participate, otherwise we get left behind. So we know that 4D is where we presently reside as a planet and as a species. The planet is able to accommodate us at a lower level of 3D. There's always the ability to descend down one step and descend up one step. So we can dream into the next level, but we can also descend. We can be accommodated at a lower level. So 4D, even though the planet is a 4D planet right now, it's accommodating us at 3D, but it's about to shift into the fifth dimension, and it is going to soon leave the third dimension in a bit of a problem, because we have to move along with it in order to become participant in this new Earth. So there's a new Earth that is actually coming whether we like it or not. And so this is this representation of the fact that the new Earth isn't going to be a physical thing that you can see. It's an etheric type of body. It's going to be invisible to anyone with 3D vision. So it's actually going to coexist while 3D exists. And it's going to move on whether you want to believe in it or not. This is another thing. Belief doesn't represent truth. It just represents choice. So this is what's actually happening right now. And we're actually in the transitional stage of this experience, okay? Good. Now we have some evidence to back it up. We have a few things that are of interest. We know about the Mayan calendar. We heard so much about it. This is a stela that was discovered in the region around Guatemala, where the Mayan culture thrived somewhere between 380, yeah? It's about 600, yes, 300 to 900, yes. But anyway, there was an advanced society, culture, civilization that took time very seriously. And they devised a calendric system that was able to map out 5,125 years of human experience that dated back to 3,114 BC and culminated at 21st of December 2012. And so when they calculated this, they were able to find out that what was told by the Mayans to us was that 21st December 2012 would be the end of time. But of course, it's been misinterpreted to mean the end of the world, and so we've had a big hullabaloo about it when it was happening, okay? But what was really happening is what they were talking about is that the way we perceive time is going to come to an end, and a new sequence of experience. Some people actually believe that that the Earth is going to stop revolving this way and move it. There's a thing called zero time. Some of the metaphysicians have come up with very interesting theories. That's another talk. I wouldn't want to get into it because you can get lost in that experience, that conversation as well. But the Mayan calendar is one of the artifacts that gives us some sort of takes our attention towards the idea of the Earth moving towards a change. The precession of the equinoxes is another piece of evidence that we've been able to put together, because we found out that the 21st of December 2012 coincided with something that people consider to be the end of a cycle called the precession of the equinoxes. What the equinox precession cycle represents is the fact that the planet is tilted at 23.5 degrees, and so that our planet is actually going through, over a 26,000 year cycle, a movement through 12 of the astrological signs that every 2,000 years we shift, and we're coming to the end of the age of Pisces, and we're supposed to be entering into the age of Aquarius. We got at 25,780 years. There's going to be plus or minus a couple of years, so I'm just going to round it up to 26,000 years just to keep the argument going, all right? Yeah, so what happens is that the 21st of December 2012 seems to coincide with the transition from Pisces into Aquarius. And some people thought that the new millennium was representative of that, but we know the Gregorian calendar that was devised by the Romans that moved us from a lunar calendar into a solar calendar wasn't quite mathematically accurate. And so we could, based on the evidence of the stars, think that maybe that point was not 2000, but it could have actually been transitioned at 21st December 2012. So this tends to be close enough in the ballpark to confirm or to validate the idea that the planet is actually going through a shift. The system of Orion is represented by three systems called the Orion Belt. All right. To the right we have the Pleiades. To the left we have Sirius. The Pleiades represent 7 suns. They call them the 7 sisters. We might as well call ourselves the 8th sister, because we're actually in a pattern with the Pleiades in that we orbit around Alcyon. And this cycle is bisected over a 26,000 year period by an extension of the photon bands that we described as 7D, we call the photon belt. Now, the photon belt is an interesting phenomenon. It was discovered in the early 60s by satellite to be an interstellar cloud that NASA was surprised to discover out there. It was later confirmed in '77. The 2 voyages, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, was sent out at the edge of our solar system. And they were able to take pictures that discovered, to our dismay, the presence of something that looks like a photon belt right there in our galaxy. And in this system right around Alcyon, it looks just like that, just like the ring that you saw in the picture here before, all right? And this is the actual pixelated image that was released by NASA to confirm, yes, indeed, we are about to head into an interstellar cloud of dust. They called first the Golden Nebula, but now we're calling it the photon belt. If I go back to this picture here, you'll see that the photon belt represents a band of frequencies that takes 2,000 years for us to transit, and then during that transit, we were supposed to enter into something they call in ancient literature the golden age, because the frequencies that we're going to experience, gamma rays and such, is going to activate our DNA and participate in the shift that we're supposed to experience as human beings. All right, so we've got an ascending path on the left, a descending path over here, and 2,000 years in between. And we're right at the cusp of entering into it, and according to NASA, we're actually in it already. All right, so we've got physical proof, you know, so it's not a theory. there's actual evidence to support it, okay? All right, so here we go. The Milky Way galaxy is a system that has 9 spiral arms. We belong to the Orion arm of our galaxy. Our sun is located 1 million light years away from its center, and we're in a 225 million year orbit around it. And one of the things that supports that we're actually in the middle of a shift is an interesting alignment where, first of all, there's the great galactic sun, there's Sirius, there's Alcyon. Earth orbits Alcyon every 26,000 years, so it's rounded off. And we find that around the 21st December 2012, there's an alignment of Alcyon with Sirius and our sun to the great central sun. And we call that, of course, the triple solar alignment. And this also occurs the 21st December 2012. So far we've got the Mayan calendar. We've got the photon belt, which is being confirmed by NASA. We've got this great alignment, which we know is always portends shifts, all right? And the interesting thing about it too is that Alcyon, which we circle, has just completed a 225 million year cycle around the Milky Way galaxy. It's already completed 1 cosmic year and taken us in tow with it. So there's too much coincidences here with alignments and astrological evidence to support the idea that we are actually in the midst of a change, okay? So, something that you guys may find some familiarity with, the Yuga cycle, which is something that is very familiar to you people. Well, not me, you people. That's a bad thing to say. We don't like it, and nobody else likes it, okay? Yes, anyway. So the Yuga cycle is a system taken from the Hindu religion that describes the path of humanity that began thousands of years ago, in a period called the Satya Yuga, which describes mankind at a golden age where mankind has mastered unity consciousness and basically exists at one with divine intelligence. And it represents the very best that humanity can aspire towards. And that existed thousands of years ago, but it's followed by a silver age called the Treta Yuga, which is now called the mental age. And it describes a period where mankind still existed in unity consciousness, but duality consciousness began to enter into our spectrum of experience, where wars and domination began to find an expression. And that's followed by the Dwapara Yuga, known as the Bronze Age. It's also called an energy age because this is the period where mankind began to experiment with technology, and unity consciousness has taken a backseat to a more materialistic culture. And that's followed by the Kali Yuga, which is the descent into total materialism, total duality consciousness. It's also known as the Iron Age, and it represents a period that we are apparently existing in right now, where we've completely removed from unity consciousness and we're completely involved in a materialistic duality consciousness, and it dominates mankind's behavior, and it represents the worst that mankind can engage as far as behavior and the morality is concerned. And it's an interesting description because it seems to mimic the earlier cycles. There was a esteemed Hindu scholar, let me get his name now. What's his name again? Sri Yukteswar. And sometime in the late 1800s, he came up with a book called, I think, The Divine Science, or Holy Science, right? And he described, he was able to decipher the cycles, and he came to the conclusion that when you combine the years of the Satya, the Treta, Dwapara, and the Kali Yugas, that it comes up to, he said 24,000 years. But if you look at the coincidences of the cycles around him, he might have been off by about 2,000 years. We could give him, we could forgive him for that, because it was in the 1800s when he came up with this, when we didn't have all the technology and the science to support it. But what he described was a belief that mankind had now been involved in the age of Kali, the Kali Yuga, and we've departed out of it about 300 or 400 years ago. And he describes that particular period as culminating in the Dark Ages. But based on the astrological evidence that we see, we could believe that the actual end of Kali is actually the 21st December 2012. He's not around for us to have that discussion. But, and it seems to be more supportive, especially given the fact that he describes the cycle to be divided into two 12,000-year periods, which maybe now with a change of the numbers, two 13,000-year cycles, coincident with the cycle around the Alcyon. And what really drove it home is he said something in his writings about our sun taking on a sister sun, a dual sister sun, and I'm paraphrasing now, and revolving around it. He actually described the movement of our sun around Alcyon. And this is what drives home the idea that what he was really describing was the cycle around Alcyon. And so with that being said, since the cycles go back in reverse, we've just entered back into Dwapar, where the obsession with technology, but a reintroduction of spirituality has begun. Of course, it will eventually culminate in the end of time, at the end of this cycle, back into the golden age of spirituality. Am I just about out of time? 9:45. I'm not going to have. I need to come back to finish this talk. But now, what we want to I want to just touch on quickly the fact that there have been some changes in our solar system that represents our entry into this particular active, energetic phase, with the increased cosmic rays, with increased plasma. It's created an increase in solar flares, a increase in solar winds, and has created changes on the planets in our solar system. There's been a heating up of the planets themselves, which is coincident with what we've been calling global warming, but it isn't just unique to Earth. We found that there's global warming happening on every planet in our solar system. There's been the development of auroras around planets that hadn't had them previously. The Martian polar caps are melting. We've got nascent atmospheres developing on some of the stars, some of the moons and some of the planets in our solar system. And we've got evidence to support that our entire solar system is heating. As a matter of fact, they estimate that 2/3 of our global warming is actually due to the increased influx of cosmic rays into our planet. And we can only really attribute to 1/3 the actual effect of fossil fuels. But this buys into the whole conspiracy theory that global warming isn't real. I'm not one of those people. I'm just supporting the metaphysical evidence and the astrological and the evidence to show that if there's changes going on in the other planets, how come we're isolating our changes to being something that's totally human-made when every other planet out there is showing signs of warming up? Okay? So there's other changes that tends to hint at the fact that we are entering into some changes here. The Schumann resonance is a baseline frequency that was discovered by an esteemed German scientist. I think it was a German, Schumann, Winifred Otto Schumann. He came up with this measurement that measured the baseline frequency of light within the ionosphere and the planet's surface itself. And they came up with a figure of 7.83 hertz called the Schumann resonance. And it was a constant that was so dependable that they were able to build the communications grid. The military was able to build its communications grid off the Schumann resonance, and discovered sooner, recently within around about 96, the Schumann frequency for the first time was measured to have changed, to increase from 7.83 to somewhere about 9, and as late as 2006 it has been measured as far as 13. Something that's supposed to have been a constant, suddenly our planet is showing evidence of increasing its frequency. So it's almost like, and of course there are naysayers who don't believe this, but you go to I don't want to get into that. But Russian scientists and German scientists have confirmed this fact, okay? So the Schumann resonance is important because this 7.83 seems to resonate with a frequency of our own experience. If we were to take a look at, this is what the Voyager looks like, the Voyager satellites on the edge of our solar system. And this is what the solar flare, the solar winds looks like as it impacts. And, there are things that are happening on the surface, where the surface of our magnetosphere, the magnetosphere is the shield that our magnetic poles has created around our planet that deflects cosmic rays. there's an interesting situation going on where our magnetosphere is actually weakening, and the increase in cosmic influx has actually created breaches in our magnetosphere up to 4 times the size of Earth. And through that, we begin getting an influx of increased cosmic radiation into our solar system. And this is something that supports global warming as being a result of increased activity in our sun, which seems to be an increase in our solar and in cosmic radiation, and which seems to confirm that we have indeed entered into a space where there's a quickening, which sort of like points back to the photon belt. All right, and this is another picture that represents the interface between our magnetosphere and cosmic rays called the bow shock. That has increased in size about tenfold in recent years, indicating that our cosmic radiation signal is increasing, okay, and is affecting us. Okay. Now, I was getting back to the actual human frequency of 7.83, and if we were to measure brain waves using the electroencephalogram, we will find that there's a frequency range that can describe human consciousness. We have gamma waves that are greater than 40 hertz that measures human mental activity when it's multitasking. And then we've got the beta waves that it represents mental activity with everyday activity when you're involved in processes outside of your physical experience. Then we've got the alpha, which seems to, which represents where we're in right now after half an hour of meditation. Calm, relaxed, alert. It is a state we actually enter to when we're in meditation, between a frequency of 7 and 13, which is where the Schumann resonance is. And then when we go into deeper meditation, like in sleep, where we're not involved in any outer experience, when we go into the light sleep, where we can experience dreams, we get into the theta. And of course, the delta is deep sleep, where the restorative functions of the body are able to function, increasing growth hormone, et cetera, et cetera. But what is interesting is that with our alpha state coinciding with the same frequency of the planet, seems to suggest that the reason why we're at peace at that frequency is because we're resonating with the Earth. And if the Earth's frequency is increasing, then we need to raise our frequency as well. We have to raise our consciousness to keep up with the planet. And the fact that we're seeing this shift in the upward seems to suggest that the planet is moving with or without us. So we have to get involved in the kind of experiences that we're doing here right now. We're having this kind of conversation so that we can reach a threshold radiance in our astral bodies so that we can participate in the shift, in the change, or we stay behind and get left with the ones that are not able to keep up with the shift from the fourth dimension to the fifth. So, what else we have? Further evidence of something happening in our human experience is the fact that our pineal glands, which was once the size of a golf ball back in the day when we were more in Satya, the humans were more of a higher level of spirituality. The pineal gland was originally the size of a golf ball, but since we descended into Kali, it's now shrunk to the size of a pea, and it's calcified by the time we reach our teenage years. And we know that the pineal gland, as we said before, is the ajna, is the third eye, which is the portal to the higher realms, to the celestial and the causal body, where we experience oneness with creation and oneness with God. So the pineal glands is something that is becoming activated by the influx of radiation to this planet. Is our DNA is able to actually pick up the signals of the gamma radiation that's being sent from the photon belt, from the galactic center towards us, and try to bring our frequency to a level where we can actually shift physically from a carbon-dense type of body that we're experiencing right now to something that is closer to crystalline. Some people actually believe that our carbon-based molecular structure is going to shift into silicon, which is like this crystal that I'm wearing right here, and that we're moving towards something that can house the frequencies of higher consciousness, okay? So we've also got some evidence to suggest that the junk DNA that was sitting there and called junk, nature never created anything that's redundant. So the fact that 90% of our DNA is inactive is a suggestion that we've been dumbed down, all right, to a two-stranded being, when we actually have the actual DNA material that, when it's fully awakened, becomes a 12-stranded DNA system. And this is what the 12-stranded DNA system, it looks like a star tetrahedron, which is one of the geometric symbols that represents the the true shape of our spiritual body, something called the macabre body. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but yes, and they've also discovered that at the level of the lowest pixelation that you can bring the reality to, they discovered that shape is in the form of a tetrahedron. So the tetrahedron seems to be a shape that is reflected in our actual spiritual core, our identity, our actual being, and it's reflected right here in the 12-stranded DNA. So this is what's happening to us right now. We're moving from a 2-stranded DNA system to a 12-stranded DNA system. And this is all happening right now. Even our chakras, we're familiar with as being the 7 chakras, is also undergoing a change. And we're moving from a 7-chakra system to something that looks like this, a 13-chakra system, okay? Where we've got our lower 3 chakras that represent the physical experience, but now the spiritual chakras have just become more diverse, and they've become more complex and more sophisticated so that it can actually process experiences at 5D, where unity consciousness can actually be processed. And it's an interesting, that's another talk we can have at another time, okay? But it's an interesting thing. I think very few people are seeing something like this, but it's happening. So we've got all of this evidence to suggest that humanity is actually going through a metamorphosis. We've got the chakras that are evolving. We've got the DNA that's moving towards a 12-strand system. We've got the pineal gland that is beginning to increase in activity. And we've got all of the astrological and planetary signs to suggest that we're in the midst of something called the Ascension process, okay? Good. And this is something that I wish to remind people of, that this was something that was spoken of, but people missed the point when Yeshua is the true name of Christ before the Romans messed with it. And Christ consciousness represents this level of consciousness that he had attained. And so he said, the blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. He's referring to the new earth, the 5D earth that's occurring right now in the Ascension process, okay? And that's it. I don't think I have time to go into the second half of my talk. I can save this for the next time. So we'll just end it right there. And I think that I've used up all my time, but I'll take 1 or 2 questions if I'm allowed. All right, otherwise that's me. Thank you very much.